Hi, good morning. It is April 22nd, regular meeting of the Eugene Planning Commission. We start with public comment. The Planning Commission reserves 10 minutes for public comment at the beginning of the meeting. At this point, I don't think we have any items scheduled for public hearing or public hearing items for which the record is already closed, so I'm not sure that's relevant today. I think we have a couple people from the public. Does anybody want to speak today? No? Okay. So we'll go to agenda item B. It's a work session, and it's a land use code audit, and we have Jennifer Knapp from the City of Eugene. Okay.
Terry's going to be
And Terry Harding. We're going to switch it up. And she'll inform us who's here.
Hi, Commissioners. Terry Harding, the Principal Planner for Long Range Planning. And today we have some guests from Angela Planning Group to present the findings of the Land Use Code audit. So Kathy Corliss and Jamin Kimmel, correct?
Yes.
Are here. And I'm going to just give a little bit of framing, a little background on how we got this project and the funding. The gist of it is that we're implementing a state grant that was awarded to Eugene for the specific purpose of identifying potential barriers to housing types identified in Eugene's housing needs analysis. And I brought that with me because we talked about it last time. It's an attachment to our comprehensive plan in this binder, and it was part of our residential land study that we adopted along with the urban growth boundary. That whole thing is online if you want to read through it in your spare time. Our scope was defined by the timeline available for this grant. All work products have to be complete by June 30th of this year, and by the available funding, which we were able to increase from the original award by a little bit. But basically, I worked with city staff, Jennifer Knapp, and DLCD rep Patrick Wingard, and our consultants to kind of hone in on a set of housing prototypes to use to test the code for barriers. And we walked through that at your last meeting on March 18th, the approach to completing the audit. Today, we're actually going to walk through the findings and discuss what we found. And in general, we aim to keep the discussion focused on the findings of the audit. We'll answer your questions, ask for your feedback, and then invite public comments in addition to any further comments that the Planning Commission has via a survey after today's meeting. So we're putting that together, and we'll put everything from today's presentation on the website. All of those public comments will then be considered by the team as the audit is finalized, and the consultants have one more work product after the final audit, which is a draft schedule of code amendments. And that would kick off a totally different phase of this project. We're hoping that DLCD would receive some funding to allocate out to cities to actually implement code amendments that a jurisdiction deems are necessary based on their review of the audit. So if there is money available through a second grant cycle, we will be applying for it. I also just wanted to say that we've received a little bit of public comment already on the draft code audit, and it's really helpful in identifying issues that we'll have to grapple with as we work through this. And there's some pretty big questions where we're going to be adding housing types that we need to our community. We're also eagerly awaiting to hear the outcome of House Bill 2001, which will partially answer that question, at least for the R1 zone. Where should we consider actually changing the zoning? We're studying that along River Road right now to answer those questions for a key corridor. So there's a lot going on locally and at the state level, and we're working hard to coordinate all of these different pieces. Code audit is one of these pieces of the puzzle. Eventually, when it's finalized, it will be presented and delivered to the City Council. And it integrates into their work and discussions on the housing tools and strategies process. And at some point, they could choose to direct staff to initiate code amendments to remove barriers identified in this audit. And at that point, a comprehensive code amendment process, which includes a public involvement plan and all of the steps that we're used to seeing for a code amendment process, would follow. So with that context, I'll pass it off to the consultants unless we have any questions.
Any questions? No?
Okay.
Okay, great. Again, my name is Jamin Kimmel. I'm with Angela Planning Group, and I'm going to walk you through the findings of the audit. Some of this will be redundant from what we shared last time we came here and our preliminary findings, but we've refined them quite a bit since then, and also wanted to give you a chance to weigh in on the findings after you've been able to review the actual audit and read the report. So just a heads up on that. So we'll go through, if I can get this to work. I think that Terry covered most of the first topic on our agenda for the presentation, so we'll go quickly through that, remind you of the approach we took and kind of why we chose to take that approach to the audit. Discuss some of the summary findings, which are in the executive summary portion of the report. And then we'll go through each of those prototypes and just give you a quick rundown of what we found in terms of barriers in the assessment for each housing type. So I won't belabor the point here, but this is a DLCD grant. We need to be finished by June, and really, and with those constraints of the timeline, we focused on just identifying issues in the code, and so not really focused yet on developing solutions. We're proposing amendments, again, just looking for what are the potential barriers to these housing types should the city want to permit them in any of these zones. So overall purpose, to prepare this analysis looks at barriers. There's other this is kind of standard language from the DLCD grants to look at how to more efficiently implement some of the statutory requirements from the state, ensures a mix and density of allowed housing to accommodate housing needs. So that's kind of part of this, but the primary focus of this is to identify barriers, because the city has already done some other work on the other two kind of parts of this, where this funding came from and the types of projects that the DLCD was looking for. In the schedule, this is our, as far as our scope for consultants, this is our last meeting with you as the Planning Commission here. And again, we're at produce the draft audit, and we're moving into the phase to finalize the audit, get your feedback, and potentially some other public comments, so incorporate that into the final. So in the approach, Terry mentioned we defined a set of prototypes, which we thought were reasonable in the sense that they were identified as a need in the housing needs analysis to allow these housing types, and had potential to be more affordable. And that was identified in other planning efforts that have done in the past. And so given that scope, we looked at these set of housing types that are typically termed kind of missing middle or middle housing, and developed prototypes, which are really just example developments with kind of explicit assumptions about what those buildings and developments look like in terms of the site plan, density, unit sizes. So trying to spell that out so we know kind of what we're testing against in these various code standards. And an important part of this we want to make sure is front and center is that just because something is identified as a barrier doesn't mean that it necessarily needs to be eliminated. That is a kind of a policy choice for the city to consider through future processes. But part of the scope of this project was really just to take kind of an inventory of all those barriers so that moving forward the city can have a good starting place, background information upon which to kind of frame the decisions for the public about what types of regulations might need to be modified or removed in order to support wider development of these housing types. The prototypes came from a range of sources. The city had a missing middle housing types guidebook. There's a couple of different state publications from DLCD that we reused that highlighted examples of these housing types. A couple of websites that have also done this. So we use these and kind of culled together what we thought were common formats or one of the more common formats of these various housing types, so that we could kind of make it explicit what those assumptions were about what the building looked like. And so that's just background information of where those came from.
Can I ask a quick question? I want to just reiterate, all of this presentation will be accessible to the public? Will it, so they can see the resources?
Yeah, we can put the whole thing on our website.
Great.
Okay, so I'd like to just go into the summary findings. So this starts on page 4 of the report. I won't read through all of them here because I'm going to go into each one of them, but we wanted to just pull out, we're kind of looking at the audit by each housing type, but we want to pull out what are some of the general findings that we found of common standards that are potential barriers and kind of summarize those. So first one is the requirements that apply to ADUs. And generally we found that there are multiple barriers to ADUs that are significant and kind of taken together may prohibit this specific housing type in kind of more areas, or maybe more prohibitive than for some of the other housing types, just by the number of barriers that that there are. So first one, owner occupancy. I think there's been some discussion of this separately from this project, but this standard can kind of limit options for the homeowner if they do choose to build an ADU, about whether if they have to move, do they have to sell their house, if they can't rent out both the ADU and the main house, it gets complicated. That's one standard that can just complicate whether that investment really makes sense for someone. It also reduces the number of lots that are eligible. I think there was an estimate that about 25% of the lots in single-family zones are rented out, and so any of those houses that are rented out now couldn't add an ADU because the owner doesn't live on site. The off-street parking requirement. And this can be difficult to meet, and this is what the graphic here shows, because many houses weren't originally designed to accommodate 2 parking spaces. So in an example like this, where there's room for the ADU and the ADU meets the minimum lot area, or the lot meets the minimum lot standards, but the only place to put another parking space would be to add another curb cut in the, or widen the curb cut in the front yard, which probably wouldn't look very good, but really is the only place to add that. So this is just an example of where it'd be difficult to add that additional parking space for the ADU. The minimum lot area requirements, what those do is just generally restrict the number of lots where ADU could be built. And so just by restricting the number of lots that can be built, it's kind of just built in to restrict how many ADUs would be expected to be developed. Okay, the R1 zone standards. So we wanted to highlight these because this is where we found that where the most significant barriers were to the missing middle housing types. First, on the density. So the prototypes we tested ranged in density from 12 to about 30 units per acre. So the maximum density in the R1 zone is 14 units per acre. So some of the missing middle housing types are in that range, but many of them were above 14 units per acre. And so that then, in order to be built in the R1 zone, they would have to go through probably a planning and development process in order to build above that density. The lot area requirements and some of the other special lot requirements that apply to missing middle housing types in the R1 zone also are a fairly significant barrier. So the standard lot area in the R1 zone is 4,500 square feet. That by itself is not a barrier to any of the housing types that we looked at, except for the small lot detached housing. But there are special requirements that apply to duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes and row houses. And so a duplex must be on an 8,000 square foot lot, or be on a corner, or be platted in a subdivision and the lot was designated for a duplex. So those types of requirements is what really limits the development of duplexes, triplexes, and there's a similar requirement for row houses in the zone. And in the university area, all those housing types are just prohibited outright, and this just presents a barrier to kind of more equitable housing access and being able to build these housing types in all neighborhoods throughout the city.
Let's wait for questions.
Oh, sure.
Do you want to accept questions throughout, or would you rather wait till the end
I think we can go throughout, yeah.
throughout? Okay, Commissioner Baker?
Yeah, I think that's not quite accurate. West University neighborhood is R3 and R4. So I mean, we have lots of examples of 5 buildings on a site, on a small site in an R3 zone. So I think what you're really talking about is
This is just about R1.
Yeah,
single-family zones, because there's a lot of the university area that is zoned for these. So you might want to clarify that.
sure. Yeah, the university area properties that are zoned R1 is what,
The heading at the top.
yeah. And that should be more clear in the report, because we're, should be more
It
specified.
would be the south and the east areas adjacent to the university.
And in the report, we do, when we use the term university area, we specify what that means, so the 3 neighborhoods that are part of that. There are standards that aren't significant barriers too, so we wanted to also present that in the R1 zone. So the maximum height is not a barrier to most missing middle housing types, minimum setbacks, and the maximum lot coverage. So a lot of what determines the basic kind of building envelope that you can build in the R1 zone would not be a significant barrier to most of these housing types. The barrier really comes more from the maximum density and the special lot requirements. And this is, I guess, a good example of that. You know, a key finding we found is that the density and lot area standards were the most common barriers. And so this is just an example of a duplex that meets all of the same standards as a single-family house in terms of setbacks and the height of the building and lot coverage. All looks very similar, but the density is twice as much. So it's 17 units per acre versus 8 units per acre, primarily because the lot size is about the same. And so this is, I think, an example of where density is a good measure for certain things, but it doesn't necessarily represent a good measure for the visual compatibility of the building. Can be very similar in the size and scale. It's just that the units are smaller if it has multiple units inside of it. And so there may be opportunity to more directly regulate the size of the building while providing some exemptions or density bonuses or something like that. But this is just kind of an image to illustrate that. So off-street parking, the good news here is that the minimum standard of 1 space per unit is not necessarily a significant barrier for most of these missing middle housing types. Now, what we wanted to point out, though, is that requiring parking for all housing types just may result in less attractive urban design and street frontages than if parking were not required. So, you know, ideally for some of these housing types that are more narrow buildings and where the garage can kind of make up a large portion of the frontage, then it'd be advantageous to have the garage in back or to have no garage at all. So the 2 examples here, the top of this is a town or row house development with shared access and garages in the rear versus with an alley versus the kind of triplex or townhomes there that have garages in the front. So just a trade-off to consider is if the shared access or the rear garages can't be accommodated on the site, then the garages will need to be in the front in order to meet the parking standards for those housing types. An area where the off-street parking requirement could become a barrier are internal conversions. So if you have a house that they want to convert into a duplex or triplex, that can be more difficult to meet the parking because the lot might not have been designed and the house been designed to have 2 or 3 parking spaces. Oh,
Just a question, I mean, a lot of the older parts of Eugene have alleys that would allow rear parking access. Did you analyze what proportion of these lots would have issues?
No, we didn't do an analysis to figure out how many lots have alleys or don't have alleys. But we knew that some didn't and some didn't, a lot don't. So our general assumption was that if it required it to have alleys, then that would be somewhat of a barrier. There is also tandem parking is prohibited, so two parking spaces back to back. In some cases, that might be an option for meeting the parking standards in some of these areas, such as if you had a house that was being converted and it had a long enough driveway to fit 2 parking spaces, and it was being converted to a duplex or a triplex. So that's one barrier that just the prohibition on that type of parking.
Commissioner Baker?
Just a clarification, we actually allow that in multifamily zones, as long as the 2 parking spaces are for multiple bedroom units.
Oh, right. Is it just in R3 and R4?
Yeah,
I think, okay. Yeah. I think we've made that clear in the report, but maybe not on the slides. So, yeah.
So, in other words, might be relevant for triplexes and duplexes if they're larger units.
So the multiple family standards, these standards apply to any development with 3 or more units. And so some of the standards could be a barrier to these missing middle types. So the maximum setback, which requires a certain percentage of the building to be within the 10 feet of the front setback line. In this example of the courtyard apartment, it illustrates where that might be a challenge, where part of the design is to orient the short part of the building to the end of the lot. And so there's not a lot of building frontage that's right up towards the front lot line. And so could be difficult to meet that standard. The minimum open space requirements could be difficult to meet for a triplex or a fourplex. It's on a smaller lot. It's a minimum 20% open space, and then there's a minimum common open space that's part of that. And then there's a requirement that entrances face the street or be visible from the street. And many of these housing types assume that there'd be an entrance towards an internal courtyard or towards the side lot line or even in the rear. And so how it could be accommodated. So that is just another standard that a development might need to seek an adjustment to in order to meet it. And then there's 2 kind of alternative application or approval tracks that we looked at to try to understand how those might work for these specific housing types. And so under the cluster subdivision standards, while both cluster subdivision and PUD would work well for generally larger projects, for smaller projects or infill, they would probably be more difficult, have some barriers. So for a cluster subdivision, there's a minimum of 6 units. So one of the cottage cluster prototypes we looked at was a fairly small development of just 4 units. So it wouldn't be able to use that cluster subdivision process. And there really isn't an alternative in that situation besides a planned unit development. The cluster subdivision has a requirement that you meet the maximum density in the R1 zone. And so in that zone, something like a cottage cluster might not be able to meet that maximum density. In the prototypes we tested, one of them could, but a slightly denser version of it wouldn't be able to. And so having to meet the maximum density, even if you have exemptions from lot area or lot width or setbacks, still having to meet the density might be difficult. And then in terms of PUDs, PUDs allow flexibility, but there's not an outright or kind of certain level of a density bonus, and so the density standard still could be a potential barrier. There is a minimum open space and a landscape buffer requirement that applies for projects that go under the clear and objective track of the plan unit development process. And those are fairly significant. I think it's 1 acre open space, or you need to be located within a quarter mile of a park. And those would be difficult to meet for projects on smaller sites. And generally, the type 3 review process is also something that is a barrier for smaller projects. It's relatively costly, complex, and just the uncertainty of the discretionary process can discourage development. So we'll pause there. Those are the executive summary findings. Can go into each of the housing types and give you a little bit more detail on those, but any other questions on the summary?
Commissioner Ramey?
So I have actually three kinds of questions. I have questions about the next steps, which I don't know when is the right moment to say that. And then they were asking for feedback about the prototypes, and I don't know if this is the right time to say that. And then I have questions about the approach, the overall approach to the study.
Thank you. Terry, do you have any thoughts in terms of Commissioner Ramey's questions?
I think the last two are ripe now, and maybe we could talk about next steps a little bit later.
Okay.
Yeah, unless it's all part of the approach, and then we can get into it.
Yep.
Yeah, I'd say go for it.
So you want to talk about prototypes then?
Sure.
Because that was one of your direct questions, was you wanted feedback about the prototypes. So the thing I struggle with in this is that the size of the unit, I think, is a reflection of the cost to build the unit and therefore to rent the unit or to sell the unit. If we're looking at a mix of housing types that allow us to accommodate a mix of income types, and I think we're looking at the lower end of the income types, why do we have such a wide variety of sizes in the prototypes? These prototypes range from 8 to 900 for ADUs, 26 to 3,900 for the attached row houses, 1,500 to 1,750 for duplexes, and 1,500 for tri and fourplexes. So it does seem, I'm not sure how those relate to number of bedrooms. I'm really not sure how that relates to our needed housing assessment and what the income levels were. But it seems like a lot of what we're struggling with is trying to put a finer edge on this study and try to get some of this stuff winnowed down. And I see these varying sizes of prototypes, and I'm not sure if that's the best way to do it. Or maybe it is. I don't know. I guess that's my question, because it's not it's a variety, but it's a variety of within the type, or not within the type, of the type, right?
It's a great question. I mean, I think our approach was to try and identify prototypes that have been built, that are like products that are marketable and are typicals, I guess, in terms of, so like, for example, a townhouse, those sizes and so forth are products that do get built in the market today. Not to say that there couldn't be smaller units, and we could look at that. Obviously, if there's a barrier to the larger unit, say, as a result of density, then a smaller unit on a smaller lot's going to, obviously kick that same higher. So I think, I don't know, Jamie, do you want to add to that? I mean, I feel like that's a great.
It's a little bit about defining the problem, and I'm still struggling with how do we define missing middle? And I don't think, although I could be wrong, I don't think it's just blindly a range of types. It's a certain type that fits a certain income for our expected population.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and I'm trying to think about what we could do to, I mean, obviously the logical fix would be to pick a certain size unit and create a prototype that follows all of the housing types through, if it's 1,000 or 1,100 square foot unit or whatever, and then say, okay, we're going to look at that as a duplex, a triplex, row house, so forth, and carry that all the way through. And we potentially could add that. If that's the right solution, to try and at least test that to see if it makes a difference.
Well, I'm looking at the team.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it
No,
seems like
I
if that's
understand
the
the
problem
question.
we're trying to solve, then let's address this data to that.
That's a great, so I think our probably not to take up the whole meeting today, trying to brainstorm solutions, but that's a really good point, and we'll try and solve for that in the final draft. I think we'll put our heads around some solutions.
I'd just say, I think the ones that are on the higher end of that range are probably the small lot detached and the townhomes, which then you get into the 2,500 or 3,000 square feet even you could build if you had a two or even three-story townhome. And those are more likely to be built at that size, I think, because they're more marketable if they're larger, and they're usually sold as ownership units. And so I think any ownership unit, it's pretty safe to assume that most developers will maximize the size of it because that's the most profitable. And so that's probably kind of where, if we were looking at examples, and I think that's where that came from, is most of those are in that range.
I don't know if we have that data from other sort of parallel exercises, housing tools. We generate any data about what our price point is for these different?
It's a really good question. And we've tried to come at it from a variety of different angles. So when we were doing the housing needs analysis, that's a policy level analysis of trends and needs of our population, different demographics, different income levels, but it's not very precise. It recognizes that there are a lot of factors in people's housing needs, and they are going to need a variety of different, not only types, but sizes and price points. So I'm not sure we could ever come up with what we actually need and design our code to that. I guess the attempt here was to try to test for a range of things that could be built to help inform the next steps. And this kind of gets into your other questions, I think.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just trying to make sure, again, we're asking the right question. Can we narrow this? Because it's a mountain of data and it's just not, I'm afraid we'll be too general and never get anywhere.
So Commissioner Ramey, do you want to wait for your third question? We'll do round one. Would you be willing to do that?
Yeah, because I think the next question will be illustrated if you're going to walk through this.
Yeah.
Okay. So I have Commissioner Randall.
Well, and I guess my question, I think my questions and comments probably are best to wait, but they're related to overall, like, density and different things related to some of the barriers, and then some of the multifamily standards as well. So I'm thinking that should wait till the end. Is that correct?
Well, it sounds like you're going to get
better
into
to-
more specifics.
Because I know some of my questions you haven't got to yet. So
Okay. Yeah, if it's
I'm
by
thinking it
like
may be
for
best to-
specific housing types, then yeah.
yeah, mine kind of cross the zones. So maybe I'll wait.
Okay, I have Commissioner Edwards.
My question was whether or not conversions were considered in that. So like, new construction of something versus a single-family home that's being converted into a triplex or a duplex or something. Was that factored into that as well? Does that make sense?
Maybe not completely explicitly, and maybe that should be. So I think some of the duplex, triplex, and fourplex prototypes that are the stacked versions of those are the size of the building is similar to a single-family house. And so those would be good examples of that either could become as a new development or could result from a conversion. And the same barriers would apply then. And then in particular, like we noted, the parking is probably one of the ones that's the more difficult to meet there because the site has already been laid out probably to only have one parking space or maybe two, and that might not meet the standard depending on what's being built. Other than that, I think the challenge is you're on an existing size lot and you can't go bigger to meet the maximum density. But that applies whether it's a redevelopment or a conversion. So.
Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, two things. One is a sort of follow-on to the previous point about the size. Obviously, the cost of the unit is tied to the size. But I just wanted to mention that Eugene is not at all similar to, well, Eugene has and had a lot of small units, 800 square foot, 2-bedroom houses, 1,000 to 1,200 square foot, 3-bedroom houses. So the larger size unit that you're talking about doesn't sound like so much. You might want to consider that. The other issue is that, we know from census data that the number of occupants per unit keeps dropping. So I think the average now is like 1.3 or 1 somewhere in the 1.4 or something like that. So that, if you're targeting what we presume to be the market as the future unfolds, you're probably looking for units that are maximum 1 or 2 bedrooms. So the idea that, that you might size the units, as he suggested, to be more affordable, but also targeted more to the population, which might be a lot more elderly, that might be living separately, or just another consideration that would tend to suggest you shrink the size. The other issue that I had was anywhere along the way where or was it considered that you would look at the impacts of some of these changes? For example, we have the state until recently has incentives to install PV and other solar systems on your building. And the R1 is the one zone where we have some protections for that. What would the impact be of some of these building types on adjacent properties that may already have a PV system or some other kind of solar system, or in future installations? Because that would be a consideration. And an issue similarly is the impact of not providing off-street parking in certain areas that already have parking stress. I mean, there are some areas that there already are issues, and you have to, the city is compensated by going to permit systems, which, cost the occupants money.
I'll just jump in here to say that it wasn't part of the scope. So we recognize that any number of these barriers could be looked at from the other side, and they were put there for a reason. The whole kind of goal of this scope and this product is to identify potential barriers and then talk about what that means in part of a later phase. So yeah, they haven't looked at any of that.
Yeah. But we do recognize there are many, many impacts that, I think part of the scope being narrow is not wanting to treat those impacts lightly in terms of the next step is when you talk about all those impacts and figure out how to address them.
So I'm going to put myself in the queue. I like, I think in the prototype, I think there is, I have seen larger units more recently with more bedrooms. So just know that I think Commissioner Baker's kind of observation, I think we need to remain flexible, and I like the approach because it's not necessarily stagnant in terms of smaller number of units and smaller sizes. Yeah. Did you have something?
Oh, I was just going to say, I was just getting to Commissioner Baker's point. I was just in a meeting last week where we were going over census data. It's actually at 2.23 per household unit, and it's also one of the growing demographics is Hispanics, and they're even higher level than that. So I just wanted to make sure when we were quoting statistics that, especially to people who are trying to make data, let's use correct statistics.
Commissioner Rainey, you had do you want to wait on your other questions? Okay, so it seems like we're ready to move on. Yeah.
Okay. So these are each of the prototypes. So we'll walk through each of these and give you a snapshot of what we found. So under ADUs, so I won't cover this in too much detail because we talked about it in terms of one of the key findings was the multiple barriers to ADUs. But I think the things that I highlighted in the first slide were the minimum lot area and the maximum density, which are related, that are limiting the number of eligible lots, and that presents a barrier. Something that wasn't on that first slide was the cap at the size of the ADU at 600 square feet. This is rated as a moderate barrier, kind of the yellow symbol there. Moderate because this still allows, and many people would still build ADUs that are up to 600 square feet. But I think when you get to the range of 700 or 800 square feet is where it's possible to have 2 bedrooms potentially, or just might widen the appeal of ADUs. So that's just something that's noted as kind of a moderate barrier or potential barrier. We talked about owner occupancy and parking as the other key barriers there. Other standards, the maximum height, there is some specific requirements on sloped lots and setbacks from the rear lot line. That's kind of a sloped height setback that could be a barrier in some circumstances, so we noted that. And then also for conversion of existing structures. So if you have an existing garage that doesn't meet the maximum height standard, then that could be a challenge to convert that to an ADU because it'd be non-conforming and you probably wouldn't be able to meet that height standard. Questions on ADUs specifically?
Commissioner Ramey?
So I'm going to bring up a couple of things here. The way, we don't have this slide, number one. We didn't get that in the package, so that's.
Oh, the slides weren't in the package, the audit was.
So one of my points is that it's difficult, and I raised this the last time you were here. It's a little difficult when you get over to the assessment side. You have done a good job of sort of combing through those for all the zones. What you've written under assessment is for R1, for example, but there isn't an assessment for R2, or maybe there is, but you have to read it back later in the data. So one of my suggestions was, there's some way you can summarize for each zone. So you have those elements down the left are the standard, and then each zone across the top. And then we can get a better picture of how these are working in each of the zones. And I'm happy to rely on your summary.
Yeah.
It's a little easier for me to see it at a glance. And you got partway there with this slide, and so that's helpful.
Okay, yeah, I see what you're
I don't know
referencing now.
I don't know
Yeah.
where that red triangle, under minimum lot area, that's red triangle, minimum area in R1. So it's not in the other zones, or it is in all the zones? Or
Right.
I picked one to display my ignorance. I really don't know. But if that graphic was there, then I could see it at a glance. So the other I have two other really probably unhelpful and nitpicky comments. The thing that we got says potential barrier at the top. You have barrier question mark. So the red check, that's not that means there's no barrier.
The green check?
The green check, yes, yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Making my own point. So I don't know how the word barrier question mark relates to the green check. It just didn't, it seemed like there could be, that maybe that should be titled barrier assessment or something. Because when it says green check, you mean there's no barrier.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, yeah. And there's kind of a key in the audit, at the beginning of the audit, but maybe we can put that on the slides.
Yeah, I was looking at this one. It says potential barrier.
Yeah.
And the other one is sometimes the red triangle is like a fatal flaw. It's like this cannot happen. Sometimes it's, and I think page 12 in our package is an example of that. Sometimes it's, well, this can only happen on 15% of the lots or something. Well, that's not fatal. That's just, so it's like a slightly different version of that same issue. On page 12 of our packet, there are right above each other, there's an orange circle and a red triangle, and they seem to have the same weight at my reading. One of them is about how many potential properties this can work for, and the other's about the number of lots where an ADU, and they seem to be exactly the same thing, but yet one's a red triangle and one's an orange circle.
Okay, yeah, so I think that specific one we can look at and see if that kind of rating makes sense.
I just didn't know whether there was possible just to have a complete fatal flaw, and I guess this kind of gets back to my, can we hone the point of this thing at some point? Because if we're not going to change density, and maybe we are going to change it, if there's certain things that are sanctity, we're just never going to do that. Maybe that gets a red stop sign or something that says, okay, that one's just out. We don't have to spend any more time thinking about it. But
Yeah,
maybe
a
the
lot of
approach
these
is
things
to just
are-
collect them all and grade them.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then I'd say, well, the grading system isn't quite fine-tuned enough at the way it is right now, because a red triangle is sometimes fatal, but sometimes just sort of fatal, which isn't.
Fatal unless,
Yeah.
until
Yeah, yeah.
different law or different direction is given.
And the
Yeah,
one in
so there
particular
is a lot
was
of
the
nuance.
number of lots. There was some research done about the number of lots where something could happen. It's 50%. I go, well, 50%, that actually sounds pretty good. Maybe we would only want to do this kind of development on 50% of the lots. We don't want to do it on every lot, right? So why is that a fatal flaw? It doesn't.
Yeah, well, there's, there's certainly, I mean, obviously, this is a draft, so good,
Yeah.
good comment. And I think as a solution for the final, we'll go back and check them. I would say, in the interest of simplicity, we kept it to 3 designations. Obviously, that's not a very subtle grading system. You know, we could go to more. It makes it a little bit less immediately intuitive when you glance at it, but, you know, people have to think, oh, wait a minute, does the orange square mean this, you know? I mean, we could do that, or, I mean, is your thought maybe like a A through F? I mean, some sort of like a
Well,
little bit
just
more
in reading it
gradation?
and thinking about next steps, like, well, maybe there is a category here that's like, we're not going to do that. This doesn't represent the values of our community. And so that gets a different, a bright yellow, I don't know what, but that gives it a different flavor than something that, well, it only works in half the instances.
Yeah.
Those seem like very different things.
I understand your point.
Right.
Yeah, let us think about that. I think we can solve it. We may have to rethink the grading.
Yeah, I think as you go
Yeah.
forward in your findings, I think that'd be helpful to have that level of
Would it help, I'm just going to throw out a thought of how to categorize these things. Is the barrier a legal barrier, a policy barrier, or a technical standard, or, you know, kind of some categorizations to the types of barriers that things are? Some are border on financial, or kind of, are you able to do this in today's market?
Right.
What is the nature of the barrier?
To me, they were drifting
Okay.
around different kinds of standards.
Got it.
That's interesting. Commissioner Borowski?
Yeah, I think that's kind of what you just said, Terry, sums it up. I mean, some of these, in my view, are technical barriers. Should we allow tandem parking? Should we not allow tandem parking? Those types of things, the setbacks type of thing. But I think that a lot of the ones that are the major ones are policy issues. You know, and community policy issues, and community policy issues that, I hate to say this, but I mean, we had a significant conversation about these back in 2013, 2014.
Yeah.
But I think that a lot of, or there is a significant portion of our community that has maybe shifted since those policies were enacted. And so to put these up there and say, you know, okay, owner occupancy is going to change this, or density is going to change that. Those are really significant community policy issues that, yes, they're barriers, but they're different barriers than if you convert your single-family house and put an apartment in the garage, should we allow tandem parking? To me, that's not as big of a policy issue as changing the R1 density to, or getting rid of densities, or getting rid of R1 altogether. Those are different in my mind. So being able to delineate between major things that our electeds are going to have to deal with, and maybe smaller things that can be addressed in code that will significantly reduce barriers on some of them.
It's almost as if I'm hearing there's a second column, or another column, I should say. There's the potential barrier. Is it or isn't it? And is it a major policy issue, yes or no?
Yeah.
Versus, because one could have potentially any combination, you know, you could have, well, it's a moderate barrier, but it's a major policy issue. Yeah.
Right.
So let us think about that and see if we can come up with something that captures.
Yeah, because I mean, when this gets moved on, people will say, oh, well, we can adopt this, and, you know, it's a barrier, let's just remove that barrier, without, you know, if it's an orange triangle, that's a barrier, let's remove it. But if it's an orange triangle that is a major policy barrier, it's like, let's look at this a little bit deeper and dig and see what the actual implications citywide might be on something like that.
And I think for all of these, even the ones that appear minor on the face, there's still going to need to be a very robust policy conversation, because sometimes even things that appear technical in practice end up being very, very important policy discussions. So we recognize that and know that you have if there's a choice to follow up on any of these, that it's a robust conversation with the community. This is just issues identification,
Yeah.
what if, kind of.
Thank you.
Okay, let me, what could be interesting is similar to travel books, where there are several icons at a glance. So even a money sign policy, so that actually it's demonstrating that it's got 4 components. And then you're not really in a place to evaluate. It's like it's got money, you're just putting little symbols that's representing. Anyways, there were a lot of thoughts. I do want to do a time check here because we have another large presentation. So I don't know what the plan was for the presentation in terms of an hour and an hour. So do we have 9 minutes left? Is that what we're thinking?
Yes. Yeah, but I think based on this discussion, this is really good, and we'll get through as much as we can in 9 minutes. But I'd also like to propose, at the risk of not discussing this ahead of time, coming back once we have the next step memo, which will identify kind of areas that the consultants feel are ready for that next step policy discussion. And so we could come back to you in June or thereabouts to do that.
Okay,
Yeah?
sure.
Okay.
Commissioner Randall?
Just a quick comment then on some of the issues that I had. Would it be appropriate then, maybe outside this meeting, to send those to Terry or
Yeah.
that, just because I think most of mine are probably policy issues.
Right.
And
I think we want to
send
get
those
a
along with,
better.
these are the things that I see that are
Yeah.
maybe a concern or things to think about or
Yes.
whatever that
And I
seem
would
to
love to
be.
get a better description of that before we put this out for public comment via survey.
Okay.
So we're asking the right questions at
Okay.
this stage of the information that we have.
Yeah, so.
And I can probably hold mine and do it that way.
Great, I thank you
Fine
for
with
that
that.
comment. I think, because now we have 8 minutes, is let's keep very high-level discussion, and if you all can, whatever other additional comments or questions that you have, just forward those on to Terry, and it can be folded into the process, and then we'll have the check-in, like Terry was suggesting. And it sounds like someone else, Commissioner Raymond.
A high level, Terry, about whether you can do this, where the survey results fall in the sequence of what you've just proposed.
Well, it would be a survey in kind of in keeping with the kind of comments that you're having on the draft audit. So comments on the findings that can influence the final version of this. So we're very constrained by our funding and timeline for this piece of the puzzle. That's what the survey would be used for over the next couple of weeks, to feed into the consultants' work to finalize their work product. And we can have another conversation at this table about the next steps, how to use this going forward, but that would be part of a new project, new budget, yeah.
So the survey, the results from the survey go to the team, and the team decides how to change the report.
Right, in collaboration with the consultants.
The next meeting we're going to have, is we in the same category then? So our comments at the next meeting would have the same effect?
It would be done by then. Yeah, this is our last meeting
Yeah,
scoped
yeah.
for this
Our will.
product. Right.
But you will, at that point, you will have a revised version, and you all will have the documents and could certainly.
Be ready
edit
to
them.
launch into a new phase.
Yeah, or edit
Yeah.
them as
Okay,
needed.
Right.
Right, yeah.
Right.
We'll give you the Word document.
Thank you.
Now, 5 minutes.
Okay, so with 5 minutes, we will try to get a couple more of these through. And if there are, I don't know why it's not clicking here.
See, it said stop.
Census data for.
Not working?
Yeah.
The arrow key work?
June and later.
Yeah, 'cause-
Frozen?
Yeah. Do you know where the?
By the mouse.
Is there a
Yeah.
dongle in there?
Echo Northwest there.
Do they, just in the interest of time, did you want to, if you just announce the page you're on in this section, you could try this and maybe periodically check to see if the mouse works.
Yeah. So I think.
Okay, so Commissioner Baker,
oh,
hang on.
there we go.
Okay, it works now? Okay, great.
Kind of.
Unfrozen.
Okay, well, we'll try to cover a couple more of these, and if there's one that you want to skip forward to, let me know. The small lot detached houses, so the key barrier here is in the R1 zone, and this is where we tried to spell out the difference between R1 and the other zones. So in the R1 zone, in order to build small lot detached, you would have to build it as part of a cluster subdivision or a PUD, and we discussed some of the challenges can be associated with that. And that's due to the minimum lot area and the minimum lot width or frontage requirements. They would need an adjustment to those, which had to be done through that process. Those are really the key barrier there.
Stuck again.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll keep going. So under row houses, the key barrier there in the, there's not a lot of significant barriers in the R2, 3, and 4 zone besides the minimum density in the R3 and 4 zone. Row houses might not be able to meet that density. But in the R1 zone, a row house is required to be part of a subdivision with 10 units that meets the overall density standard of the R1 zone. The prototype that we had for row houses met the density, maximum density of the R1 zone. It was 13 units per acre. Different versions of row houses might not meet that. That prototype actually did have quite a bit of open space and had rear access, shared access, so it was a larger lot. So just noting that density might be an issue in the R1 zone for row houses, even if it is part of a subdivision. But the requirement to be part of a subdivision would, with 10 units, limits number of lots where that could be developed, because you need a fairly large lot to build a 10-unit subdivision.
Commissioner.
Could you just tell us what the size of the units were in the row house? Was it a range?
Yeah, it was a range, and these were some of the larger ones because it's they're a little bigger. And the smaller ones did too, because the smaller one would, the lot size is still fairly large to accommodate the parking and other requirements. Yeah. Duplexes, so the key barrier to those, so the minimum density in the R3 and R4 zones, some duplexes might meet that. But most of our two prototypes, the side-by-side prototype didn't meet that. In the R1 zone, the maximum density of 14 units per acre would be a barrier, as most the duplexes we tested were about 22 units per acre. And the minimum lot area and other special lot requirements in the R1 zone, which I mentioned. So duplexes had to be built on a 8,000 square foot lot and on a corner. And so those two factors probably limit the number of lots that are available for duplexes. And the minimum lot width in the R1 zone also would be a challenge if to the smaller prototype that we had.
Commissioner Baker.
I think your other categorization, your gradings in your circles, you probably should treat the ones that don't meet the maximum density in some special way, because I think you really don't want to build an R3 and R4 lower density development. You know, we'd more likely want to discourage that.
Oh, don't meet the minimum density.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
The minimum, yeah.
Want to discourage that.
Yeah, we do note that in the report a couple times that
You might want to have that as a mark. It's not really a barrier.
right.
Is a barrier.
You were trying to be agnostic
Yeah.
about.
About whether it is a key
Yeah.
It's
policy
not really
issue.
their role.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Evaluated.
But it is an interesting point, because again, it's a policy decision on the other side to protect that land for higher density. Understood.
The barriers for triplexes and fourplexes are very similar to what it is for duplexes. They have special lot requirements in the R1 zone that limit number of lots where they could be built, or they have to be part of a subdivision that meets the density of the zone. Lot coverage maximum is 50% in the R1 zone. That might be a challenge for some triplexes and fourplexes. The side-by-side version we used had a 55% lot coverage, so it's kind of on the edge there. And a couple of the multifamily standards, which would be applicable to these because they have more than 3 units would be also challenges.
Can I pause you? Sorry, we're a minute over time, so I don't think we're going to have time to go over it all. Do planning commissioners have any, based on your evaluation, any kind of higher level questions that would seem appropriate now before we complete this agenda item? Commissioner Baker?
The other thing I suggest is, I don't know if it's marked, but if you had the range of units specified for each one very clearly in the document, so we would know, and maybe you indicate which size of unit is the one that has a problem in that range, if it's.
Okay.
I don't know if there's a subcommittee for this particular project, but what I was thinking is that maybe that might be something to consider. And
Absolutely.
then reach out to the planning commission.
Yes. And if I don't have one, I'll ask for volunteers.
Great. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
We're
you. Sorry for the,
rushed.
oh, sorry, before you leave, sorry, my bad.
I'll be
Commissioner
brief.
Randall.
I think, too, the thing to remember in all of this is that they had a very limited timeline and scope and budget.
Yep.
So they couldn't cover everything, and that's just part of the way it works. And this isn't the final word, as you've said. That is, this gets us to a point where we can then take that next step with a subcommittee or whatever to carry it forward.
Good point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was really
Okay,
the goal.
Thank you very much.
The only reason I moved.
So we have a transition here with staff and
Will be that it's.
so the work session item we're moving to, while everybody's actually moving, is that we are going to the overview of downtown riverfront package. It's agenda item C.
Take a sec.
Yeah. While they're moving around, can I ask if staff has any comments, Robin, in commission or items from staff really quickly?
Skip that today.
You're going to skip
because
it?
We have a lot.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so today before we start this session, the staff that will be responsible today, and obviously there's a lot more staff present, is Will Dowdy and Gabe Flock. But before we move forward, I am going to hand the gavel to the co-chair because, as you guys know, I work for TBG Architects and Planners, an architectural and planning firm, and I'm working as part of the team, represent the applicant on the downtown riverfront tentative subdivision application that's part of this larger package being presented today of the downtown riverfront land use applications that will be considered by the Planning Commission. Therefore, pursuant to ORS 244.120, Eugene Code Sections 2.33 and 9.7065, and the bylaws of the Eugene Planning Commission, I am declaring an actual conflict of interest with respect to the downtown riverfront tentative subdivision, and I will not participate in any discussion or decisions by the Planning Commission regarding the downtown riverfront application package. So even though it's a very discrete part of the package, I am actually declaring an actual conflict of interest and not participating in the entire evaluation of the package. So with that, all right.
All right. Thank you, guys. And I also have a little comment to make about my involvement. So the Planning Commission will consider a package of land use applications related to a proposed redevelopment of the downtown riverfront. My employer, the Eugene Area Chamber of Commerce, has expressed support for the proposed redevelopment. And I'm not aware of any financial benefit or detriment to the chamber that could result from my actions or recommendations as a planning commissioner related to the downtown riverfront application package. However, in an abundance of caution and pursuant to ORS 244.120, Eugene Code Sections 2.333 and 9.7065, and the bylaws of the Eugene Planning Commission, I am declaring a potential conflict of interest with respect to the proposed downtown riverfront package. The redevelopment of the riverfront could bring new business to town, which could financially benefit the chamber. I understand that after declaring this potential conflict of interest, I still may participate in the deliberations and discussion of the Planning Commission, and I understand that my responsibility in a quasi-judicial setting. I take it seriously and that I need to remain unbiased during this process, and I have the ability to set aside my personal views and to evaluate the downtown riverfront application package based solely on the evidence and argument in the record and the applicable approval criteria. All right, so now that I've gotten that all out, we'll go ahead and
Yeah,
get
thank you.
started. Okay.
Good afternoon,
Hand it over to
everyone.
Gabe.
Yeah, I'm Gabe Flock, Senior Planner with the city's Planning and Development Department, and I think we're having a little bit of difficulty getting the PowerPoint presentation started, but just to let you know, we've provided all the paper copies of all the slides for you at your places. And I'm happy to introduce some of the members of the Riverfront staff team with me today to help provide the overview. With me is Will Dowdy, Urban Development Manager in Community Development. I have Emily Proudfoot, Landscape Architect with Parks Planning, and Scott Gillespie, the Development Review Manager in Public Works, and also Lauren Summers from the City Attorney's Office. So the first couple slides are really basic in terms of text, and I can cover the content of that without necessarily having a visual, but I'd like to start a little bit with an overview of some of the regulatory aspects of the process, and then we'll have Will provide a little bit of background in terms of how we got to this point, both in terms of public process and some of the more recent design decisions that have come into the updated concept plan that we're basing these regulatory changes on. Emily will help us with an overview of the park design and some of the work that's been ongoing and looking ahead at that as part of the package. And then Scott will talk a little bit about some of the infrastructure work related to the project as well. And if there is time at the end, we'll have Lauren talk a little bit about some of the tips and sort of key considerations about this in terms of it being a quasi-judicial application process. You should have all received by now a packet of the materials, and I realize it's a lot to digest. And so I just want to reassure you all that this, at least today, it's a high-level overview, but we're going to make ourselves available over the next few weeks, and frankly, throughout the whole process to help answer your questions. I'd be happy to meet with you individually leading up to the public hearing to work through any of the questions that you might have, particularly since we're constrained on time today. Just a few other reminders. So, for example, we won't be going through code line by line today, but rest assured we do have a full draft code in the package that you've received, and it's in what we call legislative format. So there's strikeout and text that's added, so you can really, I think, see exactly what's changing. And keep in mind that these are quasi-judicial. It's a site-specific set of land use applications, and so there are some limitations in terms of the information you may consider. And again, we'll help you sort through what may or may not be in the record, so to speak. Your decision will need to be evidence-based, and there are approval criteria from the land use code for each application type. So in this case, we've got a package of type 5 concurrent land use applications. First and foremost, we have a code amendment. We have refinement plan amendments involved. We have a Willamette Greenway permit. And we have a tentative subdivision and a standards review. And later on in the meeting, we'll talk a little bit more about what each of those are, how they interrelate. But I think it's important to take note of, and I particularly appreciate seeing all of these applications in context. So you can see the interrelatedness some of the changes that we're proposing relate or are dependent on other parts of the package. So that interrelatedness is important. I think it's also important to recognize that we've chosen to elevate the public process here as a package so that, for example, you wouldn't normally see a Willamette Greenway request. You wouldn't see a tentative subdivision or a standards review at that level of detail in terms of what's actually being developed. So it's a combination of both policy and draft code considerations for you, all the way down to the details of the design of the park. And so I think with that, we're almost there in terms of the PowerPoint. I just want to reiterate that you'll be hearing some information today around the city's efforts, whether it's financial considerations or the development agreement that the city might have with Williams and Dame, other details that they're in some ways beyond the scope of your regulatory review. But again, I think it's really important context for you all to see the amount of effort and work and investment the city's made to date. It's a lot of great work, but your focus will really be on the regulatory component of that. And your role will be to make a recommendation to City Council. And so understand as we move through the public hearing process and deliberations that your role is to make a recommendation on a future ordinance that will be considered by City Council. So they will have a second evidentiary hearing where they'll hear public testimony and allow new evidence as well before any actions taken. So thank you.
Can we turn the lights on?
I think this is fine.
Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, I just had a question about, I was a little confused by your comment earlier about the record. So the record, when we have the public hearing in front of the Planning Commission, that information could be new information at that point, and it would be after that that the record is locked, so to speak?
So to be clear, there are two public hearings. One will be before the Planning Commission in advance of your recommendation. And it is an evidentiary hearing, so we can take testimony, new evidence.
Yeah, it was a little confusing in your, and I wanted to make sure the public was clear that anything submitted up to then would be part of the record.
It's also true that the planning, or the City Council's decision will be evidentiary. So even at that point, we'll allow for new evidence. Oh gosh, if I can get the pointer to work. Not really. All right. And so, again, the intent is to provide a really robust public process, given the importance of this project to the community. It's a high-profile project, and we wanted to make sure that everybody has ample opportunity to provide that input. So I think I'll turn it over to Will at this point to give us a little bit of the history. Thank you. Patience.
Okay. Well, I'm glad the slides are working because I made this one myself. So what I want to do, as by way of introduction, is to talk about why we're here. You know that we're here to review a land use package. Would you mind giving me some water?
Yeah, absolutely.
To review a land use package, but the question is, what's the point, and why are we doing a land use package now? What is this? What is the bigger vision? What's prompting these changes and these steps forward? And so this, I've been told this goes back to 1988 when there was maybe even earlier when there was an idea to take the area that we had along the river and see if there was an opportunity to use it for something that had more community benefit, would bring people closer to the river and reconnect our community with the river that is critical to why we are here today in this space. And what has been really interesting to me as a reference point is that there's a growing number of people working on the project, on our team, on the consultant teams, members of the public who are interested in the project, who were born after 1988. And so that really sets the frame of this is a multi-generational project, and it makes it an easy way to understand that this is a project that will be there for people who are not yet born. And so that this is not about yesterday, today, or tomorrow, but really a much bigger time frame than that. And this is a legacy project for the community. So it goes from vision in, let's say, the 80s and 90s. It starts to work its way into policy. One example, the one I've highlighted, is the 2004 downtown plan, which has a section where it talks about developing a part of downtown along the river. There's the downtown vision. This shows up in Envision Eugene. And so it's worked its way to policy. The next step is in 2010, EWEB, as the property owner, did a master plan project. Now, this was not a land use process. It had no formal standing within our regulatory policies, but it was a massive community project, and they had a huge amount of input to develop this plan for what the community would like to see along the river. And so now we're moving from policy into specific ideas. The city took that on in 2012 through the adoption of the specific area plan, and now we're creating very specific policies for this site. The following year, 2013, there's code language. And so we're moving from policy into very specific directives for the property. 2019, we take it to yet another level of development. And what I've got here is the disposition and development agreement between the city and Williams and Dame. But there's also a couple of other pieces. There's work on the park, which Emily will talk about. There's work on the steam plant. There's work that the city is doing on the streets. And so really what you see now, what's going on now, is real people who are working on the project, putting money and very specific plans together to make these things a reality. And that's actually why we're looping back to look at some of these earlier steps, because as the process gets more focused to get us to the end result, there's a realization that a few things need to change in order to help us continue to move forward. But ultimately, the last step is the one that was envisioned back in the 80s. In the 80s, people weren't thinking about, well, what's the code going to need to look like? They were saying, what's it going to look like when we all get to enjoy this? And that's the end goal, which is in the beginning of the next decade, when we'll start to see the park open up and some of the development sites go into place. I want to show a very high-level view of what was envisioned in 2010 and the way that's evolved over this decade. And I want to call your attention to four aspects of this plan. The first is in 2010, when they were figuring out how to create a connection to the site. This is the intersection of 5th and High, and there's also a railroad track crossing at an angle, and I'm sure you're all familiar with this intersection. The railroad, because of the unique geometry of this intersection, the railroad does not allow the city to add a fourth leg to this intersection and to allow 5th Street to go through. And so 5th Street jogged up to meet the minimum requirement of 100 feet to the north and then entered into the site. One of the things that Williams and Dame and their design team said is, well, what if we don't allow cars to go through here? And then everything changed. And so by creating a small area where no cars are allowed, what they've done is they've allowed the rest of the transportation network, that's people walking, people biking, they allowed a visual and symbolic connection that goes straight through this intersection. And so 5th Street now, in this new plan, lines up with 5th Avenue lines up with the rest of 5th Avenue. And we now, this creates a connection that goes all the way from the Whitaker neighborhood straight through the north side of downtown and connects all the way to the Willamette River. And so that's one opportunity that we've been very excited about as staff, has been very successful in talking with community members. And so that's one change. Another change was that the master plan had a lot of the public space that was within the neighborhood. Quite a bit of it was down here, down by the railroad tracks, connected in with the idea of a mill race kind of a symbolic mill race wetland here. Some of it was up here. And what Williams and Dame has proposed is that we bring all of that open space and we put it into the center to create a larger, more usable open space that really becomes the focal point of the whole neighborhood. This complements directly into the park, which is the kind of the boundaries of the park are the same as they would be approximately. But it brings together this large central gathering space in the middle where the rest of the development kind of fans out around it. A third piece is the street connection came down here and then went much closer to the river. And Williams and Dame has pulled the major, that's kind of north-south street, I guess you could call it, east-west street, northwest-southeast street. They've pulled that down along the railroad tracks. And so that anyone who is moving through the site, trying to go from one end to the other, will be circulating along the railroad, and that pulls it away from the river. The fourth big change is one that's not actually as visible, and that is that as Williams and Dame have been working on this, they've been paying very close attention to the market realities. And this is something that is always in flux and will be in flux as they continue to develop the project. But they are making sure that whatever the mix of uses are on the site, they are mixed. It's a successful mix, and so so there's more residential than we had anticipated before. They are being very careful about the use of commercial, retail, and restaurant space as they try to figure out what is going to be viable for the community, what will not oversaturate the community. This is something that some people have had concerns about. Some people are disappointed that there's not more commercial on this site. But what everyone has agreed with is that we want whatever is there to be open and nothing to be shuttered or vacant. And so that's something that we'll continue to refine, or that they'll continue to refine as they move forward with the project. But it's another really big piece. And so I'm pulling those four out because I think that as we go through this process, almost every change that you'll see is a result of one of those four or some combination of those four ideas or changes or principles. So here you can see the site. The Urban Renewal Agency owns this area in white. Purchased this from eWeb, and the City of Eugene, the Parks has purchased this green area. In all, this is about 20 acres. In all, it's about 20 acres, approximately 17 in the white and about 3 in the green. Here's the way that fits in with the new plan, and you can see those the Fifth Avenue connection and any other connections working through the site. And these will show up again in the view corridors, but creating as permeable a site to get to the river as possible. Like I said, this is an idea that goes back quite a ways in terms of our planning. This is the site as it existed some time ago when it was an industrial site. And this is part of the natural evolution of a city to put its industry along the river. And then as times change, we now have this opportunity to reclaim this as a more livable space. It's done its hard work, and we can all be grateful for the economy of Eugene that helped us be where we are, but now we have this opportunity to re-envision the site. So here we are today. This is looking from the north, a view from the south where you can really see the whole site spread out with the steam plant, the opportunity for the park, the development site through there. And this is, I guess the last piece of that sequence is to see what's envisioned for it moving forward. And these are some renderings by Williams and Dame's team. So the project, the overall project has the 3 parts. I mentioned 2. There's the development work that Williams and Dame is doing, which is the majority of the site. It's about 16 acres of development and right-of-way. There's the 3-acre riverfront park, and the third piece is the steam plant, which is a separate a separate piece. It's held out from what Williams and Dame is working on with a different team, and I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. I do want to call your attention to some of the uses that will be going into this site. As I said, the park is really the chief amenity. This is being developed because of the river, and the park is the public space to be along the river and enjoy the river. The plaza area extends off of that. There's a restaurant planned right at the nexus of Fifth Avenue and the park. There is, across the street, there's a hotel site. There's a range of housing options throughout the site, including market rate apartments with some opportunities for retail or commercial space on the ground floor. There's townhouses that would be a for sale product. There's affordable housing down in the southeast corner near the steam plant. And then there's one other parcel up here that's a commercial property. And so you have a range of some commercial, retail, hotel, restaurant, and housing of different tenures and types, as well as the steam plant and the park. This is a sampling of the work that Williams and Dame has done. Williams and Dame was selected actually by eWeb through a process, and the city, the Urban Renewal Agency has been very happy to continue working with them. They were selected in large part because of their track record of doing high quality urban spaces that have a community focus to them. One of the things that's worth calling out at this point is the Williams and Dame, or the agency has a strong interest in the quality of the construction that happens. And as a way to safeguard the investment that the agency is making into the property, the Urban Renewal Agency and Williams and Dame together are working on a set of design requirements that will be that will guide any development of any of the properties. I want to call your attention to that, but also note that this is something that exists between two property owners. This is not a land use process, so it's not something that's enforceable by code. So it's something worth noting that the property owners have these design requirements that they will be evaluating all the architecture based on, but it's not but it doesn't fall into the world that you're working in as you review the project. Sarah Architects is the chief design consultant for Williams and Dame. Here's a couple of their local projects, the EMU on campus and the Tate condominiums. And then I want to talk a little bit about the steam plant. You may know that the council created a process to get to select a group to make a proposal to council. And so there's now a group led by local developers and designers who are, they will be presenting to council within the next month or so. They were selected through the council process, and they will be making their proposal to be selected to ultimately buy the project or buy the property from the agency and then develop it. And a couple images of what they're talking about. Their proposal is to bring this building back to life. They want to list it on the historic registry. They want to make it open for community use, and they're proposing a mix of some food hall and brewery and art display and performance space, co-working and other meeting space and more. And so it's a building that's intended to serve a wide variety of functions, be very welcoming to people. It's uniquely situated, being so close to the river. It's closer than we build things to the river now, which means it has amazing views as well as being a very just an incredible building through its historic character. So that's something that's very exciting, and in about a month you'll have a chance to see that at council and to see how that moves forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Emily.
Great, thanks, Will. Good afternoon. We City of Eugene Parks and Open Space Planning have been working on this project for a couple of years now. About 15 months ago, we brought a landscape architect team on board from Walker Macy Landscape Architects up in Portland. It's a team with a ton of depth to it, a lot of civil engineering, structural engineering, artists, geotechnical specialists, et cetera, et cetera. The site is complicated. It's crisscrossed with utilities. It's also along the river. So we've been doing a lot of due diligence, hydraulic modeling of the river, all kinds of surveys to work through finding out what we need to find out about this site. So also starting about 15 months ago, we started working directly and back again with the public. So the design that you see is really rooted in public engagement. So way back when EWIP was doing its master plan, I think that Riverfront Park was one of the most popular components of the redevelopment of the riverfront. I think, through our Park and Recreation System Plan, we heard again and again how much people want to get back to the river. They want us to engage the river, and they want to be able to engage the river safely and have a good time. And so to that end, we went back out to the public, and we had 3 public meetings. We had over 100 people at each of those meetings. We had over 3,000 responses to a series of surveys over the course of the summer. We had focus groups about transportation and cultural issues, and what we ended up hearing was a validation of the values that were spoken in the master plan. They were, and we were really curious about that. We really wanted to know if people still held those values more strongly, less so, or where people were at with the project. And so what we heard is that the site should be inclusive. Everyone should be able to come and enjoy the riverfront. It should be flexible. So that means it's programmable, but it's also can engage a variety of people in a variety of activities. A variety of transportation types. It should be sustainable. We should really be thinking about the environment. We're working so close to the river. How do we balance the environment, ecology, and an urban riverfront, which was people really expressed a desire for. Cultural and environmental. So the actual code designation for the parks and open space areas in the code is it's a sub district called CL, Cultural Landscape. And that was established as part of the EWIP master plan as well. And the vision for the park would really be one where we're talking about our history as a community, but then also engaging around habitat enhancement, and that, that the interpretive components of the project would really teach people about our history, both from an ecological and a cultural standpoint. So, and those values were continued to be spoken in our public outreach. People really want it to be safe, and that's a big deal, especially along our riverfront parks. And it was a message that we heard very loudly through our Park and Recreation System Plan, and certainly here at the downtown riverfront. And for parks, this is something we've been working pretty hard on operationally over the last 5 years. But fundamentally, to make a space safe for public use over the long term, we're looking at programmability, good design, programmability, and enforcement. And we've brought a lot of resources to enforcement over the years, but good design is fundamental. So we're excited to pursue that. And then overall, folks really want a kind of a balance between the natural and the urban. So they definitely want an urban riverfront park, but that can mean sort of different things. So we did some visual surveying around that. So is it like glass buildings and all concrete and 5 trees and little tree grates, or is it super duper soft on the other side where it's mostly landscape, or is it something in between? And we really heard that it was something in between. So lots of key messages there. So these are the existing conditions, which I'm sure you're all somewhat familiar with, but that's really none of the things that were just expressed in the previous slide. This is the existing bike path right about the EWIB steam plant intake. I like to call it the cattle run. You're perched right on top of the bank of the river. It's an armored bank. It's not, from a habitat standpoint, it's not particularly rich. When we talk to our natural areas planners, they're like, should we save anything? They're like, there's nothing to save. So really this means it's a huge opportunity for riparian enhancement, which we will be working on for certain. But also then a huge opportunity for people to be able to engage the river in whole new ways. Nowhere to go but up. So very briefly, this is the plan that we're currently working on. There's the red dot. So if you remember the overlooks and the views through the development that Will talked about just a minute ago, our charge for the park design is really to enforce those views, right? So we have an overlook here at number 1, just north of the steam plant. Because of some pretty significant utility constraints in this road, especially around the electrical tower, which is here, it's a good reference point, and some big pipes coming in. We don't have a direct overlook from the street, but it is pretty open, and we have an overlook here along this smaller pedestrian path. And then a big overlook here at Fifth Avenue. Also, we kept there's still overlooks at the eWeb Plaza, and then also here at the north end a little bit. So overlooks, the bike path splits into a multimodal path. So we have one side for bikes and faster moving traffic, and one side for slower moving traffic, feet, or if you ride a scoot because you're 2, you can ride on that side too. It's okay. And so that's the main spine of the park with the plaza up here. We have split the project into 2 phases of construction, mostly because we didn't have a development agreement yet with Williams and Dane when we had to make a choice about how we were going forward with construction. And so to that end, we're really looking to make sure that there was some presence or some assurity of presence on the site before we spent a lot of money on a public plaza with no eyes on it. Now that we have a DDA, we'll be looking at development of that probably a couple of years after the schedule for the Riverfront Park. Then we have this pedestrian walk that kind of reaches out and over the water. Between about 5th Avenue and the tower, we'll be taking that steep grade of the bank and laying it back. So you'll have a much gentler grade that reaches back into the site, and you should be able to see the river. And then it's a really great opportunity for some nice riparian enhancement. So taking away all those rocks and riprap and replanting it with native plants. And then we have a variety of landscape types. There's lawn, there's meadow, there's riparian enhancement, there's stormwater treatment, and then we also have art. So at the end of Fifth Avenue here, we're proposing an art pavilion, and so it's this sort of framing of the river, and then you move through it, underneath it, to go out and see the river more. Last but not least, we have a much enhanced connection up to the top of the Peter DeFazio Bridge in this location it's fully accessible. So that'll be a real help to making the connection across the river. And so here's some of those landscape types. I think, when you see so much green in the previous plan, we're looking to continue that. But there are a variety of landscapes I think that you'll experience. So there's lawn, and there's meadow, and there are overlooks, and there are courtyards, and lots more trees. So I think on the site than are currently there, since it's an industrial site. And so here are just some aspirational images that are based on the current plan. You'll see that the multimodal path here with the sort of the runners and joggers, walkers on this side, bikes on this side. Here's one of the overlooks. We're right in the bend of the river, so when you go out to that site, you can look up and down the river as it bends north, and it's just a phenomenal viewpoint. We're really excited about enhancing that. And then here's this smaller pedestrian trail that then brings you closer to the river across the site. Here's that boardwalk overlook that I was talking about with some seating structures that we're thinking about. If this image was fully developed, the steam plant would be right back here. But then you see these sort of meadows and stormwater treatments and different kinds of landscapes that are really interesting. And then the urban plaza, which is in our future. And I think we'll be looking at redesigning this site. I think the spirit of this image is really where we're going. So we want it to be heavily programmable. We want to be able to have market stalls or, event areas. We want it to be family friendly. We want people to feel like they can bring their families down here and grab a coffee or grab a beer or a burger or an ice cream cone or whatever, and really come and explore the river and have it really be a fun place to bring people and to come with your family year round. So that's a super nutshell of the project. Schedule-wise, we are looking at doing grading this summer. So work will start on the site this summer, and then we'll do full park development next summer. From a code standpoint, a lot of the cultural landscape, sort of the environmental things that were in the code, we've actually dealt with through permitting. So we've gone through some Goal 5 permits. So we did an initial Goal 5 standards review permit for the grading and utility relocation work we're doing this summer. And then there's a second one that's included in your package of work to address the developed portions of the site within the standards review. So I think that about covers it, and I think I'll pass it on to Scott from here.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I want to talk briefly about the supporting infrastructure for the site. So the backbone of the neighborhood will be a well-connected grid of public local streets. There'll be a street running up along the railroad, and that'll be interrupted by the projections of what's naturally Mill and Ferry coming down from the north. Those will be the primary streets that are going to go through the site. I wanted to draw your attention to the illustration in the lower corner. These are figures that will be included in the code updates. There'll be travel lanes on the streets. We'll try to emphasize on-street parking. There'll be wide pedestrian areas to help support this. There'll also be enhancements and treatments at the intersections to make sure they're high visibility, make sure that they're safe for pedestrians, and they also perform natural traffic calming in the area. From a connectivity perspective, there's connections that are made to 4th Street in the north, 8th Street in the south. 5th Street makes a connection over for bikes and peds. There are natural boundaries to the east and west, being the railroad and the Willamette River. So that's why you'll see smaller street connections on the south. Those will provide local access to the lots and perhaps structured parking. But for the most part, they're not extending the public street connections to the north and to the east and the west because of those existing limitations. So that meets our standards for street connectivity and block length as these roads are broken up. We talked previously about the 5th Street connection. That'll be designed as a festival street. So those are naturally designed as curbless streets. They'll be low speed, and they're meant to provide a safe and welcoming environment to bikes and peds, and also a nice amenity for any future festivals that may happen in the area. High Street exists along the site. It's already improved with travel lanes and sidewalks. Same with 4th Street. There's travel lanes, bike lanes, sidewalks already there. 8th Street exists to the south. I also think it's important to note that the city has programmed and funded 2 railroad quiet zone projects that abut the site. One is at the High Street Railroad crossing that Will had talked about earlier, right here, to enhance that connection. And we're also taking a look at enhancing the railroad quiet zone connection here, designing, constructing a roundabout, and providing that extra local street connection to the south. For active modes, as Emily had mentioned, the South Bank path will still continue through the site itself. So 5th Street will provide an extension and connection to that area. There'll also be access ways that will extend off these smaller local streets that will provide bike and ped access all the way through to connect to the path. I'd like to mention transit. While LTD isn't planning to run through the site right now, it's not on their planned routes, we're still going to be designing and constructing the streets so that transit service could be added any time in the future. Skipping over to utilities, you can see the illustration on the left-hand side. The purple areas are the rights-of-way, or the streets that'll be constructed on the site. We sat down with all the major utility providers in the area, eWeb, all of our franchise utility providers. We verified that all utility service exists on site, and we'll be extending new utilities throughout the rights-of-way, so each of the new streets and each of the new lots within the development will have the full suite of utilities. And from here, I'll pass it over to Gabe.
Commissioner Baker.
I just had a quick questions about infrastructure. Since, the separation between the railroad, obviously trains going by, and you have children or inebriated people.
Yeah.
How that separation might be handled. Is that part of your domain, or?
It's not part of my domain, but it is part of Public Works. Right now, there's a project manager that's assigned to it, and they're working directly with the railroad right now to figure out what exactly it's going to take to get these railroad quiet zone projects in. Typically, one of the main things that the railroad requires is that you really corral and control these areas. So fencing needs to be installed all the way along parallel, so it's just the actual crossings themselves at the railroad. Same thing with vehicles and bikes. There will be actually separate pedestrian controls and bikes controls that don't allow people to cross through the area when trains are approaching. So those are all improvements that are designed alongside the project themselves to be able to control all modes and have that safely, allow a train to safely go through that intersection without having to blow its horn.
And the other question I had is, you've got this eWeb transmission tower,
Yes.
and it's conceivable that, you know, over time, I mean, obviously it may not happen now, you might talk them into undergrounding that, right? So it might make sense to think about talking with them to lay down the conduit now, which would be very inexpensive, so they don't have to dig up your park later on to do that if they decided at some later point, or this community decided at some later point to underground it. The conduit would already be in place because you're going to be excavating that area already for for parks and streets and infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
So just a discussion you might have.
No, thank you.
Well, thanks, everyone. I really appreciate, and I hope the commission does too, that extra context to understand the different aspects of the project and the work that's been undertaken by the city to date. Now for the fun part, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the regulatory changes that we're going to need to make and what staff is proposing to move forward in order to enable all this. And on the slide here, we have a list again of the individual application types. And I think starting with the code amendments, I thought it would be helpful to walk through some of the perhaps more significant changes in terms of the graphics that are in the draft code. And so here you can see the existing and proposed regulating plan. It's a pretty fundamental aspect of this special area zone. And I think it's important to recognize also that the majority of the site is already zoned for downtown riverfront special area zone. And so what we're talking about is revisions to that special area zone to help fit the updated concept plan. And in particular, as you look at the new regulating plan, you'll see it's responding to the new configuration of streets. And one of the things we paid special attention to is the location of overlay areas, particularly along Fifth and the restaurant parcel here, and then extending south along Ferry. You can also see what Emily described as the cultural landscape subdistrict here for the park uses. And it also shows the Willamette Greenway setback. And within that setback, we'll touch on that a little bit more later on. Within that setback, essentially, it favors and only allows park-related development and uses. Next, we have existing and proposed height regulating plan. And I think as you look at the draft code, I'd encourage you to look at each of the lettered areas, and each one of those has a corresponding set of form-based graphics, essentially establishing a building envelope, clear and objective set of standards that are customized for each height district, if you will, and stepping down toward the river. So we won't go into detail about specifics on the height for each district, but just wanted to point your attention to that as you study the material. Here, again, we have existing and proposed street network diagrams. And similar to the height regulating plan, there are individual street types that you'll see. And I think it's important to recognize, you know, the design decisions and amount of work that's gone into considering those different street types and treatments that are appropriate, at least from a design perspective, and really customizing the rights of way, the width of the streets, and making sure that we have ample pedestrian areas where appropriate. And much like the height regulating plan, each street type has its own cross-section and conceptual diagram. I think Scott showed an example of one of those that helps to illustrate really what the intended outcome is. Here we have the existing and proposed park diagram. Again, we call this the cultural landscape subdistrict. And this diagram shows the various required amenities and some specific locations consistent with the ongoing park design for things like overlooks, seating areas, the relocated riverfront path, and areas for riparian enhancement. Here is an existing and proposed code map, and what this reflects on the left side is the existing downtown traffic impact analysis exempt area. Boy, that's a mouthful. And I think it's important to recognize that there were some policy choices made in terms of level of service and particularly in the downtown plan area to exempt development within that boundary from individual traffic impact analyses. So, for example, any development with over 100 peak hour trips would have to go undertake that process. What we weren't sure of at the time of the adoption in 2013 was how and when and really more, we didn't have a lot of precise details about the kind of transportation improvements we might need for the eWeb site. And so I think a significant difference today is that the city has much more involvement and control over the kind of transportation improvements we need to serve the site. And we're also looking at adding a few parcels just north of 4th Avenue here as well. And we'll talk about that in a minute in terms of the refinement plan amendments. So on the left, you'll see a cover of the Eugene downtown riverfront specific area plan, and this was a refinement to the metro plan, but primarily it provided supporting findings and evidence. There were only a few regulatory aspects of it, like the requirement for view corridors and some policies that were to be used for design review, and I mean that in the formal sense as approval criteria for alternatives to compliance with the standards. So one of the things we recognize with the updated plan is that there are a variety of graphics and other text and details reflective of the original master plan in 2013 that are really inconsistent at this point with the updated concept plan. And to the extent that those inconsistencies might create confusion, and then recognizing that we could take those regulatory aspects and actually incorporate them directly into the code. What we're proposing is to repeal the specific area plan. Really, you know, it served as an underlayment for the special area zone, and so we think we've taken the most important regulatory aspects, and for consistency and ease of reference and use of the code, they've been incorporated directly into the code. And so we are proposing to repeal that as part of the package. We are also proposing some specific text amendments to the Whitaker plan, which would carve out an exception and allow for the removal of site review overlay zoning on parcels north of 4th Avenue that are currently within the Whitaker plan area and zone special Whitaker with site review. And again, the interrelatedness of these applications is an important component. When we look at the existing and proposed zoning, you can see up in the left-hand corner, these are the parcels I'm talking about that are special Whitaker zoned and have site review overlay north of 4th Avenue. There are a couple other parcels here that we recognize. One was, I think, I-2 industrial, and one was public land with some overlays that really didn't fit in terms of the continuity with the riverfront park, and so we're adding those to the zone change request as well. It's really sort of a cleanup housekeeping measure, if you will. And so on the left, you can see, or I'm sorry, on the right, you can see the updated zoning diagram, which consistently will zone all of the properties involved in this proposal with the updated downtown riverfront special area zoning. The crosshatched area you can see there is also water resources overlay, and we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of the Goal 5 protections for the Willamette River. So here is a site plan that's included in the package, and I wanted to draw your attention to that. The green boundary that follows the viaduct and the north side of the railroad tracks is the what we know as the Willamette River Greenway boundary. And so that is not a setback, but what it does do is require a Willamette Greenway permit for any development in that area. It's important to recognize that as part of the adoption in 2013, we did approve a Willamette Greenway permit for any and all development that would occur within the special area zone, so long as it was consistent with the zoning. It wouldn't require its own individual greenway permit. And so, in effect, what we're doing with this package is renewing the Greenway permit. I mean, to the extent that we're changing the zoning and some of the design, we felt that, and I think the code does require that a new Greenway permit be approved, but it's a blanket approval. So again, in terms of efficiency, the expectation and the strategy is that the Greenway permit would apply and the approval would it be extended toward all of the development within the zone that's in the Greenway boundary. Another takeaway, I think, is that we recognized in 2013 that there was a good portion of what we call a water resource setback. It's a 100-foot setback from top of bank. It's already paved. It's got utilities and buildings, and it's really not what you think of in terms of a protected natural area along the river. And so what we call those in the code is prior developed areas. And so the footprint of that area is essentially carved out of the regulations for water resource protections. We expect, and I think the park design shows, that there'll be a substantial amount of additional natural area there that doesn't exist today. So moving on into some more specifics, this is just an overview plan sheet from the tentative subdivision. And again, this is somewhat unique. We don't usually bring subdivisions to Planning Commission. It's a lower level decision type, but what this will do is create 17 lots on all the rights of way and public access easements from the ends of the roads to the riverfront park. And lastly in the package is something that Emily mentioned. This is actually a reflection of the Phase 2 standards review, which has details for the proposed park improvements, some of the hardscape and like the overlook and relocated path, things that require special approval that are within that small band of water resource protected area along the edge of the river. And so with that, I think we can talk a little bit about next steps, and we may have a few minutes to talk about quasi-judicial procedures. From here, we will have a public hearing on May 7th. And again, I offer to meet with any of you in advance of that to help answer your questions individually. Following the public hearing, we have a few weeks built in case there's an open record period to allow for additional evidence. And then June 3rd and June 4th, we have 2 full meetings for deliberation and a third meeting on the 11th in case we might need it to get to your recommendation. The goal, and all of this has been staged to try to achieve at least the timing is set so that we can bring this to council and hopefully have council take action on this package in July before their summer break. And so Lauren?
Thank you, Gabe. So as Gabe has mentioned a couple of times, this package of applications is quasi-judicial, even though some of the application types are things that you may be more used to seeing in a legislative format. And so because they are specific to a particular piece of property, they are quasi-judicial, and I would ask you to keep in mind what you always keep in mind for quasi-judicial applications, and that is in particular bias and ex parte contacts. And so just, we've dealt with both of those things before. We can deal with them again. But if you have questions about any of that, please feel free to contact me and we'll figure it out before the public hearing. And then one other process piece that I wanted to bring up for the commission, both the chair and the vice chair will be out for the public hearing. Vice Chair Edwards may be able to join on the phone, but we need the commission to select someone to act as chair for the public hearing. And I'm hoping that we can do that today, so it's all set in advance of the hearing.
And it's my understanding that Commissioner Randall will also be gone for that, so I will definitely.
Have a conflict that evening.
Yeah, so I will
You will
definitely
be on the
be
phone.
sure to
Okay.
be there by.
So we have a quorum.
I would
Yes.
suggest Commissioner Borowski, because he has experience at this.
Is that a formal motion?
Yeah, I move that we,
I'd like to second that motion.
Yeah.
Great.
All right, so
That's fine.
all in favor of Commissioner Borowski serving as chair for the hearing on May 7th? All right,
Great.
unanimous.
Thank you very much.
And just
you.
to be sure, so that'll take us down to 4 members at the public hearing, so at least you 3 all intend, yeah, you're available for the May 7th public hearing.
On my calendar.
All right. Yeah.
And I will watch the hearing or the deliberations, so.
Okay. All right. So were there any other, Commissioner Borowski, you had a question?
Yeah, I guess, this is a really big package that you said, it's all intertwined and stuff like that. One of the things that would be interesting to me would be what parts of the package are in the agreement with Williams and Dame that they have, that they can, if we don't pass them, they have the opportunity to back out, and which ones might not be in that we could maybe fudge with if we felt that was appropriate. I don't want to be doing things that would be a drop dead, but yet if there's areas that aren't in the drop dead part that we feel that the public has given us input on and we have a way to adjust those, that would be helpful to know.
I appreciate that's a really good question, and I think one of the things that we're going to need to be cautious about as we move forward, and so I will be looking to legal counsel and other staff that are more familiar with that agreement to make sure that you're only considering things that are relevant to the approval criteria, and just so that we stay in the safe zone, so to speak, as far as quasi judicial procedures. But we'll follow up on that and bring some information back.
Okay, Commissioner Baker?
Yeah, I was just going to suggest that before the public hearing, if you could put together, you had some initial comments on the 4 big changes, but that's not really reflected very much in any of the documents. If you could maybe put together a 1 or 2 page sort of summary for the public that summarizes the major changes, just to make it easier for them to, they're not going to read a 1,100 page document, so. And the only other thing that I thought I will maybe talk to you about later on, but is, people are going to be concerned if there's some height changes in the document. And the way it's laid out now, it's a little confusing to figure that out. In other words, there's a zone A that sort of disappears and becomes B, but you don't ever see zone A the way it really originally was. You see zone B. So maybe you could have a drawing that would show because it looks like pretty much the heights are almost all the same. The only area that looks like it may be changed would be the parcels north of 4th Street, 4th Avenue, I guess. So anyway, it might be helpful to the public to have something that's not quite as confusing. I mean, these are useful for us, but they're just probably going to be more concerned about the maximum height allowed.
Yeah. I appreciate that. That's one of the things that we anticipated there might be questions about, particularly north of 4th Avenue, and the relationship to the surroundings. And my hope is that we'd have some additional material and perhaps even some renderings from the Williams and Dane team that would help illustrate that edge, that transition. So, in particular, with regard to height zone or height district A, where some of the more significant changes are occurring. So we can follow up on that, sure.
Yeah, no, but I mean throughout the site, if you had some sort of document that showed the maximum heights allowed in the old plan and the new plan, because you'd see that almost all of them are the same.
Right. Well, and just to point out for members of the public that may be watching, the legislative format of the draft code has all of the diagrams, both existing and proposed, so that folks can see that correlation between old and new. So.
All right, so it looks like we're just a couple minutes over time, so I just want to, everybody, no additional items from staff. We are meeting again tomorrow evening. So, all right, I guess with that, we are adjourned.